Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining in. We're still having some people joining the webinar, but it's already 10:30 European time, and well, Central European time. The UK is still Europe, and this is the sixth webinar of the organized by the Climateurope Coordinate and Support Action of the European by the European Commission through the Horizon 2020 program. And today we have two speakers who will be talking about two different subjects as usual. Jens Grieger from the Freie Universita of Berlin will be talking about non-stationary biases in climate predictions, while Eddy Moors from Alterra-Wageningen University in the Netherlands will be talking about Climate Services XXL, which sounds already quite a provocative title, so looking forward to his presentation. As usual, the speakers will have 15 to 20 minutes for their presentations. We'll take a couple of questions at the end of each one of these presentations if the attendants want to ask anything in particular. And after their presentations, we'll have a discussion motivated by the questions that appear next in the overheads. The first question, which also these two questions, the speakers are invited to address them during their presentation as well. The first question reads, which challenges for climate modeling and observations are raised by climate services? And the second one, what are the barriers that prevent a faster development of a climate services market? The attendants are invited also to ask questions, as I said before, at the end of each presentation, but also during the discussion at the end of the session. If you have a question, unmute your microphone and just formulate it directly. And I take advantage of saying this to encourage everyone who is not speaking to mute your microphone if you're not asking a question or giving a presentation. This will prevent any coupling in the sound and any interferences. And having said this, I think I'll give the floor to Jens, who will start with his presentation. So, Jens, it's your turn. Thank you very much for being here with us today.
Okay, thanks again, the organizers, for this webinar series. Then I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Henning Rust, Alex Pasternak, and Uwe Ulbrich, for a lot of helpful discussions on that topic. Most of that work was and is done in my current project called MECLIP. That's the decadal. That's the German initiative on decadal prediction. In my talk, I want, as the title says, I want to talk about the bias in climate predictions, and I want to give some conceptual ideas what bias in general is, and how bias is in general adjusted. That's I think more a reminder for everyone. And then following that, I want to discuss the certain issues we have in climate predictions with the bias, and that is the time dependency. And the goal should be that you get an idea why it can be important to know about that time dependency in the bias, and why it can be worthwhile to know about that when analyzing and interpreting outcome of climate prediction systems. So just for a wording, because I prefer talking about bias adjustment rather than bias correction. Observational data also have a bias of the truth we don't know about. So we assume that the bias of the observation and or real analysis data to be smaller than the bias of the prediction model. So we can adjust the bias of the model to the bias of the observation. That's just a wording here. At the end, what I'm talking about is, of course, the deviation between model output and observational data. Bias adjustment is important generally for a comparison between model and observational data. If we do a bias adjustment, we can reduce uncertainty of the outcome, at the end enhance prediction skill, and I think that's more the topic of the climate services, I think, but at the end I think it's important for general communication. As I said, I start very simple with some conceptual ideas. I think that's a lot of reminding stuff here, but I think it can help to understand some conceptual issues. I generated some random data here in black and red, and black can be a kind of observations and red kind of model time series here. And as you can see, this time series of both are slightly different. If I sketch here a scatter plot on the right hand side, then you can see two different things. The one thing is the regression line here is on the one hand different or has a different slope, and on the other hand the centering of the crossing point here of the regression line is not at the center. That is the representer for two different things. The one is if we want to adjust the mean bias, then assuming here we have or we can write the time series of the model with that function f depending on the time t, that's just the time. We can just add some constant alpha to that, and alpha is nothing but the mean of the observation and the mean, or the deviation between the mean of the observation and the mean of the model. And then if we do that time series of the model and of the observation has the same mean, and as you see here on the scatter, the center of the regression line here is now, or the crossing point is now at the center. That is another thing you can see, that the mean of both time series are equal. What is different still is that the regression line has a different slope. That means that the that we still have a conditional bias. And assuming, for simplification, assuming a normal distribution of that time series here, we just can adjust this conditional bias by adding a parameter beta to the time series of the model, and that beta is nothing but the fraction of the variances of both time series. And if we do that, then the conditional bias is also adjusted, and as you can see here, the regression line fits quite well. That's just to remind what we can do if we have a mean and a conditional bias. In the following, I want to focus on the mean bias. Though, if we are talking about climate prediction, we have the issue of the initialization. In the last webinar, there was also a nice talk dealing with this issue. So I think most of you know about that. that's an advantage for me. I don't have to go into a deep detail here, but I want to sketch all that idea as well in with my random idealized data. So assuming here that's also random data, assuming that can be, for example, global mean temperature, you have some noise and, for example, a linear trend. That's this. If we have some model data that is forced by, for example, an external forcing of the historical period, and we use, for example, the ensemble mean of a large ensemble, then you can imagine that this can be the result. Seeing here, we have the same trend in the model and in the observational data. So that's still not a climate prediction. A climate prediction is if we initialize the model by the observed climate state. As you can see here, for example, then the model is initialized, and then we have the problem that the model tends to go back to its own attractor, to its own climatology, and yeah, that's what we, for example, call the model drifts. That means that if you analyze, for example, the deviation of the model outcome in the first year, here marked by the green dots, to the observations, and the outcome in the second year to the observation, that's different. That means that the bias here depends on lead time, that's prediction lead time tau, and that's what is called a drift in a prediction system. To go back to my first ideas, how to adjust mean deviation or the deviation of a distribution. That means that these correction or these adjustment parameters alpha and beta depend on lead time tau. To take this into account, a very common way is to calculate or to adjust each lead time, that can be lead years or lead month or whatever, separately. That's what I will call a non-parametric approach in the following. Another idea, another way is to take this whole curve into account and to fit some function of the bias depending on lead time tau to this. That's what I wanted to call a parametric approach in the following. So that was the first non-stationarity problem. We can have another problem, that is that assuming that we don't have the same trend of the model and the observations. As you can see here, then you can imagine that at very early years, the drift behavior can be different than the drift behavior in, for example, very recent years. And then these adjustment parameters alpha and beta can also depend on initialization time t. So from a modeling perspective, there is an idea to reduce this drift problematic or this drift issue, and that is the anomaly initialization. The idea is that the model stays at its own tractor and theoretically does not show a drift. The idea is, if we calculate here the mean of the observational data and the mean of the model data, to just take the anomalies into account, and then the mean of both data sets are not the issue anymore. But as you see here, if the model trend and the observational trend is still different, we can also have the problem of the drift. That means that in the very early years and in very recent years, we still have a drift in different directions, and that means this theoretical idea works if we don't take the initialization time into account. If we calculate here the mean drift over all initialization times, then it's, as it is done here, by construction 0. So we don't have a drift if we do not take the initialization time dependency into account, but then we underestimate the bias here and we overestimate it here, or vice versa. And this concept only works in some mid-years. So this was a lot of conceptual ideas. Now I want to show that this idea also works if we're analyzing climate prediction data, and therefore I want to show some results of a decadal prediction system. Just to show there are different approaches how to take this lead time and especially then the initialization time dependency into account. I want to discuss one approach of a colleague of mine who used a parametric approach. That means that this adjustment parameter alpha I showed at the beginning, that is for the deviation of the mean, is dependent on lead time tau and initialization time t. What he did is he uses a third order polynomial in tau to describe this red curves, and these parameters a, a0, a1, and so on, to estimate this curve are also dependent on initialization time t. And then at the end we have 8 parameters here, and the result is, as you can see here, I show the bias of a storm frequency. I wanted to use a variable that is not necessarily only a temperature, but maybe more user-relevant parameter to show that's also true for these variables. And what you can see here is the bias of the storm frequency in the North Atlantic region. And here on the y-axis is the bias. On the x-axis is the forecast lead time. And here, as you can see here, first, this bias changes with lead time. That means we have a drift. And in different colors, you see the different initialization times. That means that in blue colors, we have that are very early initialization times, and red are very recent years. That means that in very early years, we have here, for example, a large bias, and this reduces with initialization times. So as you can see here in that scheme. And here, as a second example, I want to show that this is also true for the anomaly initialization system. This scheme I tried to explain is also true for concrete data. You can see here again the bias of the storm frequency in the North Atlantic. and it's quite symmetric regarding the initialization time, regarding the colors. That's what I tried to show here by that scheme, that maybe in very early years and recent years, the drift can be very similar, but in different directions, and that's what we can see here in that analyzing the data. And we just have almost no bias just for the mid period here. So I want to come to the summary. I showed at the beginning that to keep in mind what is how to adjust a mean and mean bias and the deviation of a time series. In climate prediction, this mean and deviation of the distribution depends on the lead time tau. The drift, that is this dependence on the dependency on lead time tau, this drift can be also different for different initialization times. And this can also be the case for the anomaly initialized forecast systems. And I think this, for the analysis and the interpretation of the forecast, it's useful to know about this bias behavior. And the adjustment, the correct adjustment, can enhance the skill and of the forecast system and can reduce the uncertainty. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Jens. Really interesting. Well, it's true that it's in the heartbeat of the climate services, given the number of equations that you have. But it's really nice to see all these formalized somehow. I would like to ask if there are any questions for Jens from the audience. Yes, Laura?
Yeah, that's me. Jens, what should be, in practical terms, your first approach or attack of the problem? You have your model run, you have the observations. How you should, out of all these possibilities, what should be your recipe how to start dealing with this in practical terms?
In practical terms, I'm in that decadal time scale, and there is, for example, a recommendation how to deal with decadal forecast data and how to deal with the drift, and that is, wait a second, that is just doing this easy approach to take the bias for each elite year, for example, separately, to take this drift into account. But what I tried to give an idea here is that this method is very simple and it works, but it works good with the assumption that the drift is equal for each initialization time. And it's not so bad, but as I want to say here, and it's not, as we can see here, it's hard to do a general recommendation, but as you can see here, that's obviously not the case that the bias is equal for each initialization time. Yeah, and to to give a concrete answer, I think for different parameters, one has to check whether the simple approach works fine, or whether one has to do a little bit more sophisticated one.
Okay, I also guess that it very much depends on the specific model, right? What kind of bias and behavior of the model. Is it true what I say or not?
On the one hand, it's true, of course. Different models have different biases, but the issue of drift, that a model is here initialized and then going to its own attractor. That's, I think, the case for each model. But if the model attractor and the attractor of the reanalysis, for example, is more similar, then the drift problem shouldn't be or can be different for different models. That's right.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. I suggest that we move on to Eddy's presentation, unless there are any other pressing questions for Jens. Okay, so if there are no more questions, then Eddy, the floor is yours. You should have now the presenting privileges. So just go to quick start and you can share your screen.
So good morning to all of you. What I would like to do is I would like to tell something about, say, more the marketing opportunities of climate services. So it will not be about the technical details as what Jens has been talking, but I think those are indirectly also part of it. So one thing that we see, actually, if you're talking about climate services in general, there have been some discussions already on the table for some time, starting a little bit about the definition of climate services as originally was put up by the World Meteorological Organization. And then later on, that was sometimes adjusted to make it slightly broader. So if you look a little bit at different trends that are there, you can say that there is a growing availability of climate information coming available. And I think what has been happening is that this information is being prepared and being changed towards information that is more easily usable of end users. So there's also a lot of emphasis on the end users, and that's where you still have a gap, I think, between supply and demand of data, but people are working hard on it. And among others, the Copernicus program is trying to fill this gap. And then this last one is that I think that there are still some opportunities that are overlooked. So I do think that in a number of cases there are good opportunities, but not all of them are being used. And that can be because of the existence of different barriers in different countries. So if you look at what came out from the Horizon 2020 program and what the EU foresees, it foresees an increasing demand. 4 bullets here. The first 2 bullets, I think they're already on the table. And again, that's, I think, where the Copernicus program plays a big role in there, but also there are a number of national programs in the different countries going on. The last 2 bullets, I think, is something that I think are still very open. So we do think that there's still a discussion on how the market could look like and what possibilities there are for a market, especially also an international market, not only in Europe, but also outside. And the last bullet is about barriers. So why is this market not developing as fast as maybe we would hope? And what are the enabling conditions there? So throughout the remainder of the presentation, I think there are, for me, 2 leading questions there. One is, do we need a business case for sustainable development of climate services? And there with sustainable, what I mean is that after, for example, the Copernicus program, will climate services continue, or will it fall apart, or will it be reduced in size because say the funding coming from more public sources is going to be reduced? And secondly, what is the business case? And is there a business case, and how does it look like? So I don't have solutions there, but I do have some questions, and I would like to share them with you. We have been thinking a bit about climate services, and we have been thinking that actually the World Meteorological definition, mainly focusing about supplying data and visualization of data, is too narrow a definition. So we thought it should be bigger than that, and that's why we called it climate services extra large. Same as you will see in a number of other services, it's mainly user-driven engagement that's important. But what we also think is important is that you go from, say, user information needs to sustainable climate solutions, and then opportunity, risk, and assessments, but that you also look at implementation. We think that if you are going to implement certain projects, that monitoring and evaluation, but also learning again from this implementation is an opportunity that hasn't been used very often, and we do think that there is a possibility to enlarge climate services into that direction. So if you would put it down in 4 main bullet points, one is that we think it should support businesses, otherwise you will only depend on the public sector. We do think that there is a possibility to engage businesses more, but also individuals. You could also look at what possibilities there are to integrate different tools and products and assessments, but that also means that we should broaden a bit further the information that we are presently supplying through climate services. So we think climate services should be opportunity driven, but we also think that adaptation and mitigation should go hand in hand. And I think there should be more emphasis on the mitigation part. Also, because at present you see, and I will come to that back later on, that for a number of business opportunities at present, efficiency and mitigation is more important than adaptation. Although I think both of them should come better in the picture when businesses are really interested in climate change. That also means that you have to work on co-design and co-produce, which I think with the emphasis on the users in the present climate services is already on the table, but should be worked on a bit more. So I would like to give 3 examples of existing market opportunities, which I think fall a little bit on the classical approach, but still maybe good to look at. And those 3 are 1, information services, the second one, financial services, and the third one, research and tool development. And just as examples, because I know that there are more of them, but I will just pass through them pretty quickly. One is an example of Agrifood for climate expedition. This is an example of something that has been developed here in the Netherlands, and what's mainly aiming at actually is to increase awareness of users, and by increasing awareness and engaging the users on what's happening or what may happen in a future projection, that they become interested in adaptation measures. But still the emphasis is on awareness raising. Challenges that may come out from such an exercise could be something like how to reduce CO2 of production gas. Can heat coming from the production process be used somewhere else in the production process? Is climate change affecting a cow in the field reputation? So how to deal with that? And that has to do with should you have cows in the field or should you put them actually indoors? Putting them indoors can reduce the emissions. So is one or the other very consumer driven, and where are the opportunities there? And another one is, for example, how can you develop regional collaboration for healthy food and climate friendly delta? And that has to do with things like transportation of food, but also the processing of food. And how can you reduce both the quality of the food, but also the carbon equivalent footprint. Then a second example, that's climate change in the financial sector. And this example is coming a bit from, say, the TFCD report on carbon-related financial disclosures, where it was recommended that, for example, different parties should disclose potential impacts of climate-related risk. And from that side, I do think there's a clear opportunity to work with future scenarios, but this is something that the financial sector would try to solve in the first 2 years to come. So this is a short-lived, I think, business opportunity, but still one that's on the table to be worked on. And next to that, also from CICERO, there's the climate risk and potential financial impacts. And this picture here shows actually a little bit how you go from physical risk to transition risks, and together with that, look at potential financial impacts. So I do think, again, that there's a market for those issues here, but I think it's a relatively niche and small market where some players can play a role. The last one, and the third example here, and I think actually if you're looking at market volumes, it's actually the biggest market at the moment, and that's the research and tool development. So I think in there the Copernicus program plays a role, but I also see it from other subsidy providers, that there is a request and a need for climate services. And I think based on that, there are a number of tools that are being produced, but also research is being done, and among others, also research in the sense on where the demand coming from. So user communities are engaged to see what the exact demand is and to see how we can further improve the climate system sciences, but also the information coming from that and the data there. And there are all issues like improving uncertainties or improved communication tools are playing a role. So just a few examples on this item here. And I just gave some of them coming from the Copernicus program in there. This one is from sector looking at different sectors like agriculture, forestry, health, insurance, infrastructure, and coastal areas. And this is actually mainly focusing on how to translate the user requirements into freely available climate services. Again, I think as a research and tool development tool, this is a very nice project, but if you then see that the information should be freely available, then I think it's a question, where is the business case after such a project ends? So another forward is the Zwickau project, also from Copernicus here, and that one is looking at water indicators in climate change adaptation, and that's about speeding up the workflow in climate change. And if you look at the right-hand side, then the main entities that will profit actually from such a tool development are consulting engineers and policymakers. And again, think that this is something that is of value, but the question is this a big market, yes or no? Another example is visualization tools. This is one example that's being developed here in the Netherlands, Climate Adaptation Atlas, and that brings together a bit about awareness raising, but also how can you engage stakeholders in decision making in an interactive tool. This is being used in different areas, also in the international fields, and here are just some examples where that's being used. The first one is the Climate Change Knowledge Portal that allows people to engage, say, best approaches, but also to learn a little bit more about what's happening in different other countries, depending on different sectors. CLIP-C is an indicator map viewer that can also help to inform people and to increase awareness raising and have some first information that could be of use for risk assessments. Here's another tool that's been developed for the Himalayas, where in the mountains the risks are slightly different from what we are facing here in Europe. But again, it's about information providing and about if you can say something about data availability and downskilled data. And big question is about how decision makers can then deal with uncertainties that are still of a large value there. And another one is how can you help, for example, national governments in developing visions or developing plans for the long-term future, and I think that's still something that is of need. Then if you look at climate services and business opportunities, this is a slide from another project, but I think it's a slide that tells a bit in general what you see there. So if you look from the left-hand side towards the right-hand side, then on the left-hand side it's the modeling and the data processing, which is often a public say responsibility, and then you have visualization and interaction. That I think is also something that I think, for example, at the moment is being picked up by, for example, again, the Copernicus program. Sometimes that's also been done by small private companies, but I think especially the translation towards the block in the middle through SMS apps or web information tools, and the end users, being farmers or other decision makers, I think is something where smaller businesses can play a role in. And then next to that, those farmers and decision makers, they want to use tools. So on the right-hand side, right-hand block, is something where farmers in this case would like to have information about possible measures and options that they have to reduce their risks or improve their productivity. And I think you have three general blocks in there. First one is the information and communication services, where I do think there are more business opportunities there, but you have to think about what is then the way how you can earn money with a small business. The second one is on measures and technical solutions. There I think there is some more money that can be gained in the sense that if you are able also from the research community or spin-offs to show that certain measures and technical solutions can really give an improvement in your production chain, there's value to that. So I think there's a big opportunity, and I do see this evidence, providing this evidence base coming from the scientific community, but also from the applied sciences community could be an important step. And the third one is, I think, citizen science, and that has to do also with the very fast development of smartphones and the use of smartphones, where I think another business model is using those apps where you have, say, a huge number of apps being used, but at a small rate. It could also be not only an interesting business case, but also, I think, in the sense of a sustainable future interesting. Because if you provide information to a larger public, you also get a better engagement with the public. And I think both for, say, the public bodies, governments, it's of interest to engage of a better way with citizens. So I think there's a sort of a double win in there, that both you could create a business by informing citizens on what's happening, but also offering them possibilities to act, and by that also for public entities to see how their policy lines could further support such development. So I do see that last one as a very interesting development that could take place. But most of them are, I think, relatively small businesses. And if you then look at opportunities in the somewhat larger sector, and now I'm talking about the larger companies, actually, in my opinion, what you see at the moment, that those larger companies are mainly interested in efficiency improvement. And that means that they are mainly interested to see how they can further improve their revenues. Of course, there are a number of companies that go a little bit further than this, but most of them are still working on, for example, energy efficiency, which is a clear one. If they can improve their energy efficiency, they will for sure be engaged with this. But what you see less, I think, and there is, I think, a challenge, is can you also provide such a company with information on what the risks are on their production lines? And then I'm talking about primary production. And are they interested to know somewhat longer term trends, climate trends, and by that learn how they could further improve their sustainability? And I do think that there are some great examples there, but I also think that a huge development is needed before this can be taken to the next step. And just an example about how difficult this is, coming, for example, from Unilever, where if you follow the news a little bit, there have been an offer to take over Unilever, and based on that, there was a decision being made that actually the sustainability program with Unilever is going a little bit too far, and that they should first further improve the revenues to assure that such a bid not necessarily needs to be accepted. So this is just an example that if something happens and in such a company, and if that may hamper the revenues, then I think the sustainability part is not that easily maintained, even with a CEO that really would like to improve the sustainability picture of such a company. So if you then look at climate services, and now I'm coming back to climate services extra large, there are, I think, two main issues there. One is that I think if you want to create a business, and I'm now talking about private business, and you want to engage them, you will need to link up with the user community, and that means that you have to start thinking about operational services. So that also means that for me, the challenge how to go from climate to weather and vice versa is a very big one, because if you are talking about operational services, you're actually in just a very few cases talking about climate trends, and in most cases you're talking about weather and operational services. Of course, developments towards seasonal predictions and decadal predictions, I think, is a major step forward in that direction. But I think there's more needed before it can become a real business case. That's on the private side. And I think if you're looking at climate services more for the public side, I think policy support is also important. And policy support can both be for public and private parties, but I think mainly for public parties. And if you then talk about public parties, I think that there is a bigger need of regional impact assessment models that really combines not just one sector, but different sectors together, and that help different public bodies to develop their strategy and their subsidy program, and how that further may support developments that they foresee in a view of climate change trends. So if you then get back to, say, the leading questions, so do we need a business case for sustainable development of climate services? Yes, I think we do, because what is the business case? I do think that if we're talking at presently about climate services, it's mainly supported by public money. I think it will be supported also by public money later on. But I do see the present funding level as something that is really to give starting up push. And I wonder if after the end of Copernicus, for example, this public budget will still be available. I have my doubts there. I do think that if we would like to continue climate services there, we should count on to a lowering of this budget. So I do think that the research and tools development will go to a much lower level of funding, and that we really have to think about business cases in a different level. And there, I think that one of the main sources of added value, in my view, could be if we are able to better link up the long-term trends to operational information. And so going from climate to weather and vice versa. So those are actually, in brief, my views on how I see this development of the market, and I'm open for discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Eddy. Very interesting and very comprehensive. I'd like to see if there are any questions from the audience. Otherwise, I have a question myself, but let's see if anyone else wants to jump in. Okay, so if nobody else has a question, I'd like to ask you a bit more information or a bit more detail about what you had in one of your initial slides with the climate stress test. And I would also like to know your views about opportunities that you were making emphasis on, about, in particular, those opportunities for to have new businesses in regions that well, couldn't consider them before, like for instance, being able to have different or new crops in Central or Northern Europe that were not feasible a few years ago, or having a certain type of tourism in other regions that will be feasible because of changes in temperature. So how does that fit in your scheme, which is very comprehensive, as I said before?
Yeah, I think that's a real good example about how we should think a little bit further how we can develop a business model, because what you see presently is actually for a development of, for example, a new crop, or developing, say, new tourist possibilities in certain areas. I think what we are providing with the present climate services is we are providing an overview when and at what places certain changes may take place. So I think by that we are providing an overview of possible opportunities that are there. But after that, I think the main business case is by the people who are developing the tourist industry. And there they will not need climate services anymore. So I think in that sense, climate services is just a very small part of the total development of such a new sector in those areas. And so the question for me is a bit, can we now come up with another business model where from the climate services part we are longer and more deeply engaged with this new developments? And that's an open question for me. I don't have an answer there.
Okay, thank you. So I suggest that we move on to the last bit of the webinar, which the two presenters can give their views about the two questions that we usually ask them to all the presenters. So you have them. You should have them now on your screen. So the first question is the challenges for climate modeling and observations raised by climate services. And I wonder if either Jens or Eddy want to give their views on it. Jens, do you want to start to address this question?
Yeah, I can do. I have one slide on that. Yeah. Actually, I'm not in that climate service part, but motivated by my talk, I think it can be, or it's very worthwhile to provide data which has a small bias for different reasons, and because of that, I just listed here some bullets concerning this bias issue. And if a communication or a climate diagnostic or a validation with observations is done, we always need quite a long time series, and that's always an issue. The small scale, I think, is can be difficult. What I mean with that is, if we look at common data products of observational or reanalysis data products, they always have or they sometimes have problems on the small scale if you want to compare that, for example, with station data, which should be more the truth than reanalysis data, and so on. And I think that that can be an issue. And what I put here is if the full 4D information, that is three-dimensional field and the temporal information, can be only achieved by the help of some model that is, for example, then a reanalysis product. And as I said before, that has its own problems. And the same is, I think, for the model data. A resolution of the model is always a problem, or that means if we want to analyze high impact events, for example, they often need a higher resolution, and also including complex processes, and that's always computationally expensive. I think that's more from a analyzing perspective. That's my my idea for that question.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. So from your point of view, is more about getting better data that that might satisfy the requirements from the climate services. And do you, just out of curiosity, do you have much interaction with people developing climate services?
I think much is not true. In the current project we are doing is I think I have I'm doing my first experiences with the climate services, and we we tried to, for example, as one outcome of our project, we tried to publish the results of our decadal predictions for the next 10 years, not only in a scientific way, but for the public. We tried to make the predictions for the next years, and we had a lot of discussions how to deal with that, and I think that was my most experiences I had with the climate services here.
Okay, thanks a lot. Eddy, do you want to have a go at this question?
Yes, I do think that for me there are, like what Jens was saying as well, I think there's a big need on more precise data, both in time and in space. And I do think that actually with the present climate models, although we're going to higher resolutions all the time, we're still not there. And so I do think that there's still a lot of uncertainty in there. And I also think that a lot of interest is on the extreme side. And so I wonder if this development of the present climate models to be used for that is the right way. And what I'm talking about is, for example, what people would like to know is things like recurrence interval of certain high-intensity rainfall showers. And I wonder if that's not something to be maybe better developed by smart weather generators instead of trying to use the entails of climate projections. So that's for me an open question if we're choosing the right tools to address some of the questions. And do you also want me to react to the second question, or?
Yes, please go ahead, and that way we can jump to that one.
Yeah. So I think for the second question, what's still unclear is what the added value is of climate services, and if we can't show what the added value is, it will be very hard to really create a big market for that. So I think good examples where we can really show how climate information has been used and how that has either helped to reduce damages or how it reduced costs are urgently needed before we can make this step. So getting that information together, I think, is very urgent to try to do that. And then another way of doing that, and that's coming also a little bit from this example that I gave on the financial markets, is if from, say, the public bodies, and then I'm talking, for example, from the G20 or from the European Commission, there is a clear recommendation or maybe even a compulsory advice that financial products should show possible impact of climate risks. So what can greatly help in developing market opportunities is from the public side, these compulsory measures are being taken. So I think collaboration with, I think, the climate services people together with the policymakers could help to further support market development.
So from what you're saying, there is a lot to be done with from the research side, at least in terms of illustration. Do you think research is going in the right direction to address the issues that you're raising?
What I think is that at the moment we're still putting too much emphasis maybe in getting the numbers, say, more precise. While I think we still haven't solved the issue, how can we use this information, and what information and what level of precision does the decision maker needs? And now I'm really talking about, say, the climate trends. I do think if you're more looking at operational services, where you're looking at more short-term ones, there I think the accuracy in the numbers is becoming more important. But I think for the long-term climate trends, those numbers are of less importance, and it's more about how can we assure that the trends that we are showing are really the right trends, and how can we communicate the different scenarios, for example, that have been used to produce those numbers.
Okay, thank you. Jens, do you have a view on this second question?
Yeah, it's more a question than than the answer. And I'm wondering. Eddy mentioned that seasonal and decadal predictions is an important but still not the major timescale for the climate services. And because I'm more in that topic or in that timescale, yeah, I want to ask why that is the case, or did I understand you wrong?
No, I think you understood me rightly. So I think there's more value in having the seasonal predictions correct, because that becomes of importance for a lot of operational work that's been done by different sectors. Well, if you're talking about climate trends, and then I'm talking about 30 years ahead or even further ahead, that's, I think, of more importance when you are making a vision or a long-term planning. And in general, a public body or a company will do that maybe once every 3 to 5 years, but not on a regular basis. While, for example, seasonal planning is an operational one, and I can imagine that depending a bit on the sector, that's something that they would need every month or every 3 months.
Yeah, and the decadal predictions are exactly in between that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, as you said, that can be an interesting or important future timescale to take into account.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Eddy, you wanted to say something else? Please go ahead.
Yeah, I do think that in future that will be of a lot of importance if we're able to do this. For me, a question is a little bit at the moment we're separating weather and climate rather strongly. And I wonder if we should not think a little bit about how we can better engage the two and talk about, say, the whole range from weather to climate instead of trying to put them in, say, separate boxes.
Yeah, which are a bit artificial to the users anyway.
Exactly.
Yeah. I wanted to offer the opportunity to the participants to raise any issues or even make comments or questions. Is there anyone who wants to say something? Okay, it doesn't seem to be the case. So we are already 6 minutes past the time. Well, I think we should start wrapping up. Eddy and Jens, do you want to formulate any final comments or raise any issues that you'd like the community to address on your behalf?
Jens, you start? Or shall I start?
Yeah, please start. I have to think about that.
Just an open question. Like I said, for me, there are some questions where I also don't know the answers. So I'm very much interested to know from the community if they're encountering some other examples. And I also express my personal view on how I see things changing. So I can imagine that others have different views. So if people would like to discuss this a little bit further and also to see what could be a next step forward, then please contact me.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thank you. That actually we will be in touch with you a bit farther into the development of these projects. So Climateurope is a very long project. It will still be alive until 2020, I think, or 2021. So for sure we'll count on you, because hopefully the situation will evolve in a couple of years' time. We might end up having a slightly different scenario to the one we have now. Jens, any further comments from your side?
Yeah, I think the statement of Eddy I found interesting, that you said we are currently dealing to make the numbers more precise, and that's not the major issue for the climate services, because what I'm talking about and what my motivation was to take the model output and to make it in a kind or in a way more precise. And I think in a way it's still important to do that, to reduce the uncertainty. But yeah, I don't have an answer, but of course I find it an interesting statement that that it's not the major issue of the climate services currently.
Okay, very good. Okay, so on these notes, I thank you all, the presenters and the attendants. As usual, the presentations and the video will be made available from the Climateurope website. Marta will also provide a summary of what has been said here, so that people can digest things much quicker. And basically, I would like just to say that this is the last webinar of this series. We are thinking on extending the series a bit longer, but this will come after the summer. It has been very well received, and again, I would like to thank not just the presenters today, but all those who participated in the 5 previous webinars. Thanks very much, and stay tuned on the Climateurope website. Thank you very much.